Did America just gamble our national security over a proxy war that, well, Ukraine appears strategically incapable of winning?
That really is the core question, isn't it? A very high-stakes one we need to unpack today.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into a stack of sources, really looking at the dramatic escalation in the Ukraine conflict. We're focusing tightly on that recent U.S. decision about long-range missiles, lifting restrictions,
Yeah.
and the conservative critique of that policy, plus the, well, very explicit nuclear signals from Moscow that came right after.
Yeah, this deep dive is critical because, honestly, the stakes just feel higher than ever. The White House recently lifted those employment restrictions on the American-supplied ATACMS missiles.
ATACMS, that's the Army Tactical Missile System.
Exactly. Shorter to medium-range ballistic missile.
Yeah.
And lifting the restrictions means Ukraine can now strike military targets inside Russia itself. Now, an analysis from the Heritage Foundation called this needlessly reckless, and it immediately drew a major physical response from Russia.
And not just words this time. A physical response we hadn't quite seen before in this conflict.
Precisely. Russia retaliated almost instantly by launching a nuclear-capable, intermediate-range ballistic missile. But, and this is key, they armed it conventionally. It hit a target in Ukraine. This wasn't just, another strike. It felt like a very clear message. We're in a new danger zone.
And we have to understand the gravity here. You mentioned the nuclear aspect.
We absolutely do. Russia operates roughly 10 times as many operationally deployed tactical nuclear weapons as the U.S. These are the smaller battlefield kind, the ones potentially more likely in a regional fight. So our mission today is really to get our heads around how this U.S. action crossed what Russia clearly stated was a red line, and frankly, whether the military gain, if any, justifies this kind of risk to American security.
Okay, let's walk through how we got here. Because it's been a slow boil, hasn't it? Since the invasion, the Biden administration has gradually sent more powerful stuff, tanks, air defenses, artillery.
Right, but always with that crucial string attached. Only use them inside Ukraine's own borders.
And each time, Moscow would issue these nuclear threats.
Every single time. And, for a lot of analysts here in the West, it started to feel like threat fatigue. They sort of dismissed the warnings like the boy who cried wolf. The thinking was it was probably just bluster, just trying to scare the U.S. off from sending more aid.
Which brings us right up to that big shift, November 2024. The administration lifts the restrictions on ATACMS. Strikes on Russian soil are now okayed. But what's really interesting, even odd, is that the administration itself seemed to downplay it tactically. They said it would not be a game changer on the battlefield.
Which makes you wonder, right, if it's not a game changer, why take on this massive nuclear risk? It seems like a very high-stakes gamble for potentially limited battlefield return.
And did Ukraine use them right away?
They did. Almost immediately, Ukraine launched ATACMS at targets inside Russia. But Moscow's reaction this time, it was just qualitatively different, not the same old threats.
How so? They didn't just put out another angry press release.
Yep.
What made this feel so new?
Well, they didn't just talk. They essentially rewrote their own rules of engagement publicly. Within days, Russia published an updated nuclear employment doctrine. And it stated very clearly that an attack on Russia by a non-nuclear country, but with the, how did they put it, the participation or support of a nuclear power. I mean, that's clearly pointing at NATO, right? That would be seen as a joint attack on the Russian Federation.
So they basically drew a new line in the sand, saying, if your missiles hit us and they came from the U.S., we might consider that an attack involving a nuclear power.
Exactly. It codified their red line. It essentially said, we reserve the right to use nuclear weapons if you hit us with a major attack using these U.S.-supplied missiles.
And then came the physical demonstration you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Not just words, but an action. Russia hitting Ukraine with that nuclear-capable missile, an IRBM, maybe an RS-26 variant, but armed conventionally.
Yes, and think about the effort involved there. They had to physically remove the nuclear warheads from that missile system and put conventional ones on instead. Our sources are suggesting this might be the first time we've seen this kind of sophisticated physical signaling, maybe ever, even during the Cold War's worst moments. It was like showing exactly what a nuclear strike launch looks like right up until the last moment, but without the nuclear payload.
Okay, not everyone agrees on exactly what that missile strike meant, but based on the sources you reviewed, how seriously should Washington be taking that signal? Is it credible?
The consensus among the analysts we looked at is pretty strong. The message seems unmistakable. The U.S. crossed a fundamental line, and the implied message is, next time that missile flies, it might be armed with something other than conventional warheads. Washington really needs to seriously consider that Moscow might now be approaching the point where it will employ nuclear weapons on the battlefield in Ukraine. And given that huge 10-to-1 imbalance in tactical nukes, the risk calculation for America just becomes intolerable.
Intolerable risk. And yet, instead of maybe stepping back, the next thing we hear being discussed in Washington is even more provocative. Tomahawk cruise missiles for Ukraine. The administration actually confirmed this is on the table.
And this specific idea is just incredibly high risk, mainly because of what Tomahawks are. They're offensive weapons, very accurate, fly long distances, and crucially, they can carry nuclear warheads. Their range, up to 2,500 kilometers. That's almost 10 times ATACMS.
Wow, 10 times. That means they could hit
Moscow, St. Petersburg, deep inside Russia, launched from Ukraine.
Okay, you can imagine the reaction from Moscow to that particular idea.
Oh, it was dramatic, absolutely. Russian officials immediately said supplying Tomahawks would destroy what's left of U.S.-Russia relations.
Right.
A senior lawmaker in Russia threatened they wouldn't just shoot down Tomahawk missiles, but also bomb their launch sites. Now, that could imply targets inside NATO territory if they were based there, though that's unlikely. And Russian state media, they called it worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay, but here's where we need that dose of reality you mentioned. The talk is scary, but how realistic is sending Tomahawks? The analysts you mentioned called the idea fanciful and detached from military realities. Why?
Well, for a few really practical reasons. First, Ukraine simply can't launch them. They don't have the platforms, the guided missile destroyers, the submarines, or even the U.S. Navy's new ground-based Typhoon system. They have none of that hardware.
And then there's the missiles themselves. We don't exactly have an unlimited supply, do we?
Not at all. The entire U.S. stockpile is thought to be under 4,000, and production is slow, maybe fewer than 200 a year. The Pentagon sees these as incredibly valuable assets, especially, thinking about potential needs in the Pacific. Plus, there's the technology risk. Giving such advanced tech to Ukraine risks it falling into Russian hands. The U.S. has only ever sold Tomahawks to extremely close allies: the U.K., Japan, Australia.
So let me get this straight. We're talking about potentially supplying a weapon that Ukraine can't launch, that we probably can't spare, and that we wouldn't want Russia getting its hands on anyway.
That's basically it. It sounds like, well, an empty threat, doesn't it? But it's an empty threat with potentially catastrophic consequences.
How so, if it's not real?
Because the talk itself, just floating the idea, creates what analysts call an intolerably high risk of nuclear escalation. Moscow might actually believe it's a genuine possibility, perhaps a threat to their nuclear command or key leadership targets. And they might feel forced to react preemptively based on that fear, leading to a catastrophic miscalculation. The military utility for Ukraine seems near zero, but the political signaling risk is immense.
Which brings us to the politics behind this and the conservative critique of the strategy. Sources we reviewed suggest the real goal of this recent escalation wasn't really about winning on the battlefield, but more political, trying to strengthen Kyiv's hand for eventual negotiations, right? Maybe letting them hold on to gains like in the Kursk region as a kind of bargaining chip, especially with a possible U.S. administration change looming.
And that's exactly where the conservative analysis really digs in. They argue that this focus on fancy long-range missiles like Tomahawks completely misses the elephant in the room: Ukraine's most critical actual need, which is manpower. You can have the best missiles in the world, but they're useless if you don't have enough trained people to operate them. And, more fundamentally, enough soldiers to hold the front lines.
Before we even get to the high-tech stuff, we need to look at the situation on the ground. What do the sources say about Ukraine's ability to keep fighting this war, regardless of the weapons we send? The picture painted is, well, that's pretty grim, isn't it?
It really is. It points towards a genuine crisis of manpower and maybe even morale. The war effort is apparently being sustained by what's described as a coercive mobilization regime. There are reports, detailed in the sources, of aggressive tactics, government agents, even called people snatchers in some accounts, allegedly pulling young men off the streets to fill the ranks.
That sounds desperate. And the human cost.
Staggering. Estimated Ukrainian military casualties are put somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 killed. And when you have that level of loss and that kind of forced recruitment, you inevitably get widespread evasion. Some reports claim draft dodging is as high as 30% to 70% in certain units or regions.
And that creates fairness issues too, right?
Absolutely. It apparently leads to the stark two-tiered system you hear about. Working-class men, men from rural areas, are the ones being forced onto the front lines, while reportedly the children of the political and economic elite find ways out, loopholes, bribes, maybe enrolling in foreign universities. That kind of inequality eats away at national unity and the will to fight over the long term.
And this is the core of that conservative argument, isn't it? That U.S. policy focusing on missiles feels detached from this harsh reality. Even Jake Sullivan, the former national security advisor, reportedly acknowledged that Ukraine's main challenges were mobilization and manpower, not just needing more Western weapons. The basic point seems clear. Tomahawks, or ATACMS, can't win the war if the country itself is running out of people willing and able to fight. So, wrapping this up, what does it all mean for you listening to this? It looks like U.S. policy, this constant push for escalation, lifting restrictions, sometimes maybe against better military judgment. It seems to have driven Russia to change its actual nuclear doctrine, significantly raising the risk of a global catastrophe.
Yeah, the core takeaway from these analyses is that the risk versus reward just seems dangerously out of whack. Risking any kind of nuclear conflict with Russia, even a limited one, over Ukraine is arguably not in America's interest. It doesn't seem to offer any real strategic benefit to the American people, especially if Ukraine's fundamental manpower problems mean they can't even fully leverage the advanced weapons we might send.
And that's why you hear these conservative voices urging the president, or perhaps the president-elect, to step back, to reimpose sensible restrictions on how U.S. weapons are used, and crucially, to push hard for a diplomatic end to this war sooner rather than later.
Because failing to do that just keeps us on this incredibly risky path. And it leaves us with a final thought, a question for you to ponder. If this Tomahawk threat is, as sources suggest, militarily unrealistic but politically incredibly reckless, what other fanciful threats might be floating around Washington right now? Threats maybe detached from reality, but that Moscow could mistake for real intent. That kind of miscalculation based on unrealized threats could be the thing that accidentally triggers the very nuclear nightmare both sides say they want to avoid. That remains the biggest danger of all.